Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 183. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Paul Lamb about his new book, One Match Fire. Paul describes this novel as a love story, involving the love between grandfather, father, and son, as well as the love they all share for a little cabin in the Ozarks. The cabin is a place where the characters can leave their lives behind and just be themselves. That setting was inspired by Paul's own cabin in the Ozarks, and he admits the cabin in his novel became a character itself, with its own emotional journey. Paul also explains that he never intended to write this novel. In fact, it was never meant to be more than a short story. But when that short story got published, Paul decided to write another, and then another, and another. He wrote 10 short stories in all, and by that time he decided there was probably enough to sit down and finally draft a novel. In this episode, I'll chat with Paul about his writing journey, his plans to write more books featuring the characters from One Match Fire, and why he believes everybody is a story, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Paul Lamb, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I really like this podcast, and I think it's a pretty good fit for my novel.
Good. Well, speaking of novels, I thought what we could do today is talk about your new novel, One Match Fire. If you don't mind, tell us a little about this book and what inspired you to write it.
This novel is, I want to say, it's a love story between a grandfather, a father, and a grandson. And the love they all share for a little cabin down in the Missouri Ozarks where they can put aside their squabbles with each other and find peace and happiness together. I like to think of it as a peek, a glimpse into the emotional lives of men and boys, which I don't think there's a whole lot of in the literature. So I like to think that's a nice contribution and just a different perspective. And of course, the cabin itself is a character and that has its own emotional life over the course of the story. As far as where it came from, I never intended to write this novel. It began as a short story, a single short story, what eventually became the prologue of the novel. And I wrote that because I do happen to have a cabin in the Ozarks. And I wanted to sort of give my children a template, a suggestion for what they could do with it once I was gone, which is essentially what's happening in the prologue when the son has to decide about that same issue. And I like that story. I thought it worked really well. It eventually did get published as a standalone story. But I found that I also liked the characters, and I certainly knew the setting thoroughly. So I thought, well, what else could I say about these people and this cabin? And so I wrote another story, which turned out to be my one and so far only teenage sex story. But that worked well and was published. And I said, well, what else do I have for these characters? And so I continued to write stories. I got 10, I think it was 10 of them published. And I talked to a writer friend of mine and I said, I feel like I have a story cycle here. And he says, no, you don't. You have a novel. Now sit down and write your novel. And that's what I did. I looked at what I had and I looked at the gaps and, what important life events needed to happen and to be given to the reader and so forth. I filled in the blanks. I completed the novel. I gave it to my usual readers, and they all said they made their contributions. One friend of mine sent me like a 6-page letter going chapter by chapter saying, here's this, and how about that, and you know what you need to do here, and so forth. And I kept refining it, and I tried to find an agent for it. And I'm not sure if it's just too hard a market to break into, or if it's too unique an approach. The books about men and boys, but I had no luck, and I was beginning to think that I could serialize it on Substack and put a chapter up each month and get readers that way. So I was considering that, and I'd have to learn how to use Substack, and oh boy, who wants anyway. I just happened upon a publisher in Wichita, Kansas, who wanted literature about the Midwest. And so on a whim, I sent it to them. That was in December. And in May, I heard back and they said, we really like this novel. Is there any chance it's still available? And of course, I write back, trying to control my fingers and control my voice and said, absolutely, it's available. Yes. And that's when the whirlwind began. It was published within 5 months of acceptance.
Wow.
We went through all kinds of developmental edits and line edits. We did this, we did that. We designed the cover. My clever and very talented daughter designed the cover image, and they gave that to their designer, who completed the front and back covers and the inside and so forth. All of that within 5 months, and then it was released in October, and it's been out in the world ever since. I've been looking for it in the wild. I haven't found it yet, though.
I'm sure it's just a matter of time.
Yes, it is in the Library of Congress. I'm pleased to say that, so it's a good thing.
Good. When your friend said what you have here is a novel, was that really the first time you thought, wow, there really is enough material here, there's enough life in these characters, in this world, that
yes, I can honestly say that was. I
really?
Thought, I have these great short stories. I have nearly 50 published short stories. I considered myself a short story writer. So when I had these, I said, well, that's more of my collection of stories. But it wasn't until he said that that I began to think of it as a coherent whole that could stand it on its own.
Yeah. When we were corresponding back and forth,
yes.
One of the things you included in sort of your summary of the novel was I thought, a very nice statement about your book. And you wrote, it shows ordinary men living ordinary lives. Mm-hmm. But to the man living his life, nothing ever feels ordinary.
Yes. I think there is drama in every life. The most mundane life is full of more drama than another person could hold. If I knew another person as well as they know themselves, I couldn't manage it. Everybody's life is full, and it's full of challenges. It's full of rewards, disappointments, and pleasures. Everybody is a story. And some people will write sensational things, and there's certainly a market for that. And some people like me will look a little more closely and quietly and write what I see. And it benefits, too, that I know the setting so very well. I live in Kansas City. I grew up in St. Louis, and I have a cabin in the Ozarks. Those are the three primary settings. So I know that intimately well. And I know these characters now very well. In fact, so well that it's turned out this book is the first part of a trilogy. We'll see how far that goes, but I have the second novel written, and I'm working on the third about these characters. I'm glad that this seems to be my big subject, the relationships between fathers and sons. I have 3 sons, so I fed a lot off of that. In fact, one of my sons said the the novel was just too personal, Dad. And I guess he recognized himself in one of the characters.
Well, let's talk about the characters. Like you mentioned, this is three generations,
Yes.
fathers and sons. Can you introduce us? Basically, tell us a little bit about them. What do we need to know about them going into the story?
The first character, the grandfather, is Joe. And in the prologue, he's old and infirm. He's losing his mind to dementia. But when we meet him as a character, he's a youngish man. He's about 40. He's a wandering soul. He and his girlfriend were hippies in the 60s and never laid down roots. But her father dies in Kansas City, and they come to her house, the house she grew up in, to settle the estate. And they find that they want to stay anchored there. And they also find they have a baby on the way. So this is a wandering soul who we later find out had been abandoned by his own father. And so what he wants, he doesn't have any experience. He doesn't have an example of how to be a dad, how to raise a son, but he wants to do it right. And so he spends the rest of the novel atoning for his own father's abandonment and trying to do it right. The son comes along, the middle character, David, and he's just a wonderful boy. I like to think drew him as an elemental person, just your basic human person. He goes through life as one of the world's C students. He's never going to be really smart, but he's really good and loyal. He's honest. He's hardworking, and he's going to meet life as well as he can. And he meets a girlfriend who astonishes him in high school, and that leads to the third character when they sneak out to the cabin to share their virginity with each other. And oops, they have a child as a result. And it's the third son, the youngest character named Kurt, who is one of life's A-plus students. And that's a sort of a tension in the story between David and Kurt, because David is your everyman and Kurt is the exceptional man. He begins to draw himself away from his father. He feels that he doesn't need a father anymore. By the time he's finished with high school, he thinks he has it all figured out, and he holds his father at an arm's length. But he also has a big secret, and he doesn't think his father is emotionally developed enough to understand his secret and accept it for what it is, which increases the tension between them, which then gets, I hope, sufficiently resolved in the last chapter. But they're three very different people, and they interact with each other. They have their squabbles and their happy moments together. And the cabin is where they can always put everything aside and just be together with themselves as themselves.
Well, and let's talk about that fourth character, the cabin. Tell us a little bit about this setting and why it is so magical for these characters.
Well, I don't know if you've ever been to the Missouri Ozarks, but it is magical. It's one of those places in the world that just draws people. I have a cabin about 2 hours from my home down in the Ozarks. It's not quite as much acreage as the characters in the story have, and not quite as nice a cabin as the characters in the story. And I have a lake, and I have fish in the lake, which they catch a lot of. What I have and they don't have is beavers. Now, beavers have moved in and they're eating my forest, which isn't in the story. But it's a way to separate themselves from their lives. It's a 2-hour drive. They leave behind everything. There's no running water. There's no electricity. All of their life is left behind, and now they're kind of at a basic human level. They can drop their masks. They can drop their personalities that they wear among the public. They can just be themselves there. And I think the forest allows them to do that. I say in a few places where they have an innocence. They can become forest animals themselves without agendas, without plans or conniving or anything like that. They can just be. And the forest lets them do that. And the cabin, of course, is a warm place for them. It's always safe and secure. A lot of the scenes take place in the bed there, and they all share the same bed. Three generations will sleep in the same bed at night because it's safe. It just registers with them as a safe place. And of course, because they're in the middle of 100 acres of forest at the end of a road that doesn't go anywhere else, so no one needs to drive down it, they can skinny dip, and they do. That's part of being natural. It's part of dropping the mask. They can just enjoy being in nature as participants in nature.
You've written this novel, you've combined these short stories, developed it into a novel, and you said you're working on the trilogy. Second manuscript is done, working on the third. Did you approach 2 and 3 the same way? Did you start with sort of snippets, short stories, and weave them together, or did you tackle the novel sort of as a whole?
I did the second one the same way. In fact, I didn't, just with the first one, I didn't think I was writing a second novel. I wrote some further stories about these characters, and I think 5 of them are published as standalone stories. But then I felt the urge. I thought, I've done it again. Let's finish this. So I wrote the entire thing, developed some characters further. There's a character who comes in near the end of One Match Fire named Kelly, and he becomes a major character in the second novel, and we get a great deal of his backstory. And I did the chapters in One Match Fire are episodic. Whatever's happening in that moment is what the chapter is about. We might jump 5 years before the next chapter begins in the characters' lives. And that's how it's going with the second novel, which I'm calling right now Nature Always Wins. And nature has a double meaning in the context of that novel. Now, the third novel the one I'm working on is one that my editor said she wanted to read. And that's about the character Kathy, the wife of the middle character David, the mother of Kurt. She wanted to read that. And I thought to myself, well, there's no way I can write that. I'm not a woman. I haven't grown up with the experiences of being a woman, a girl. How could I possibly write that? But I started, and I'm at more than 80,000 words now, and I'm at about the halfway point. And it's pretty much a story of her life. It's not a recapping of all the events in the other 2 novels from her perspective, but her story. Now, some of those other events do pop in now and then, but only from her perspective. And that one is being written as a continuous narrative. It's not episodic. It's when one chapter ends, the next chapter follows moments, hours, days later. That's been a challenge for me. I guess I'm just not used to writing such a big work in a continuous approach, but I enjoy it. I've already given what I've written to my wife because she happens to be a woman. And she might be able to provide some perspective on the girly things that I just don't get, or girls would never talk about this and they would talk about that. And why didn't you bring up this subject? Because that's important. So I'll get that perspective, and I hope I can do justice with it when I go through phase 2 of the rewrite. It's gratifying. It's very gratifying to have these characters. When I wrote that first novel, I said, I have this nice cabin. What can I do with it? Okay, I'll write a story about it. And then look how it's blossomed. Now I have 3 novels. So I'm very grateful.
And it all started with the cabin.
Yes, it did. Yes, it did. And the cabin, I think, started with my time in the Boy Scouts as a youth, because that was the first time I heard a whippoorwill. And, those things will drive you mad because they just keep repeating their call 20, 30, 40 times. But it was so beautiful to me. And so I incorporate that in the novel. And that's why I wanted a cabin. Once my wife and I had enough nickels and dimes put aside, we got a piece of property and we built the cabin. And I think it came from my youth, the experiences of my youth.
And you mentioned that prior to One Match Fire, you were the author of dozens of short stories, essays,
Yes.
smaller pieces. I'm curious, were you Were you always a writer? Is this something you have always done?
My mother says so. She says I was always writing a story and reading it to her as a child. I can barely remember some of those, and I think I was retelling old folk tales and fables and things, but I was doing that. And they would always say, "Where's Paul?" "Oh, he's upstairs reading a book." And everyone would nod their heads like, "Oh, yeah, that makes sense because that's Paul." So I was always bookish. And I always thought, yes, I'm going to write just as soon as I have some life experience or some self confidence or maybe some classes, maybe some free time because 4 children came along quickly. Yes, I was always going to write. And for a long time, I was writing feature articles for newspapers and magazines as a freelancer. And they were all sweetness and light. I wasn't doing any investigative journalism or ambush journalism or gonzo journalism. It was just profiles of this business executive or what the conservation department's doing to bring bald eagles back to Missouri, that kind of thing. And that was satisfying. And I got paid a little bit for it. And it was a hobby. And during some of my business working career, I was doing technical writing, which was writing instructions on how to do this. And here are the steps you need. And here are the documents you need in advance. And here's where it should be on the screen and so forth. And that was, I would call that writing, but it was soulless. It wasn't at all gratifying. It was only for paying the bills. But all along, I was fooling with short stories, trying to develop a style or an authorial voice, trying to see which genre I could write in. And I fooled around a little with some very mild fantasy and mild science fiction, some humorous things as well. But I was all over the place and I wasn't getting a focus yet. And there was one story that I consider my watershed, and that's a piece called Velvet Elvis. And it's about those art fairs you see where they close a couple of blocks in the street and everybody sets up tents and sells their art. And when I wrote that piece, I was very snarky about it. It was sort of a chip on the shoulder narrative voice, and it worked. And the piece was published. It won an award. And that was when I thought I had the control finally. And I knew what I was doing, or that I could rely on knowing what I was doing. When it came time to sit down and write, I had the skills. And it's been fine like that ever since. Once I had that confidence, I was able to move.
You mentioned that this book is literary in nature, character driven.
Yes, I think so.
A number of your stories are. When you write these stories and you delve deep into these characters, do you find, after having written them, that you have learned something, have found some answers to life or yourself or people in general? Or do you end up really with more questions at the end, more things to delve into? Do you find either of those scenarios in your writing?
I think I can answer this indirectly. In One Match Fire, there are, 23 chapters in a prologue, I think. And between each of those is about a 600-word first-person vignette spoken by the characters. And one of the things I learned, those were all a very late addition to the process, because what I learned was it's as though the characters are alive and were speaking to me. Mm-hmm. And they were saying, this narrator that you have for this novel, the guy who's telling this story, telling our story, is over sentimentalizing our lives. Now, there's a reason for that. It's based in the character's history, but it was as though the character said, we want a voice too. So I put those vignettes in between each of the chapters to let them speak for themselves. That was a big discovery on my part, that the story that was so heartfelt to me, that I worked so hard on, was idealistic and not all that accurate or as deep as it needed to be. And so that's how those came in there. I don't have those in the sequel, And I think it's because I learned the lesson to be a little more realistic about the harshness of life or the rude realities of life. But that was a lesson I learned. Now, I don't think it's teaching me more about human nature in general, but well, now this is weird, but I had a bit of an epiphany the other day that to these characters, if they exist, I'm sort of their god, and it's really making me push to finish the third novel because this poor woman doesn't exist unless I make her exist, and she has a life.
Yeah.
And so I have to get this thing written down. That was a revelation for me as well, that these people are depending on me. They don't exist, and yet they have that power over me to get their story down. It's another thing I'm grateful for, to have learned that about myself and my creative process. I guess more like my creative drive.
Right. And an interesting perspective, a good lesson to learn. I think most writers probably feel that, whether they put words to it or not.
Yes.
And what have you learned from readers of One Match Fire? What has been their response?
The novel makes people cry. A lot of people have said, "Oh, you made me cry at this scene and that." I don't know if that's a compliment or not. I'd like to think it is. And in the prologue, when the son is reading his father's journals, and he comes across a reference to somebody whose initials are KD, that has sparked a lot of interest, because who is KD? Even the son wonders that. And it's never revealed in the novel. And the point of that is to say that no matter how intimately we know someone, there are still going to be things we'll never know about them, that they still have complexities that are beyond us. That was a role of the initials KD in that journal. And it's something that's come up with in conversation several times. So I think it's touching a nerve, but I think it's an important thing to do.
Yeah. And you're right. Readers like everything wrapped up nice and neatly. And it's hard. It's like a dissonance when something is left out there. Was it clear in your mind, or was it also sort of a mystery to you, even as the writer?
Well, the KD does reference a specific person I know, but the purpose always had been to be a mystery.
What other goals do you have as a writer? You mentioned these other books that you're working on to finish out this trilogy, but do you have other goals for yourself as a writer?
I am retired now. We worked hard, my wife and I, and we saved well, and we can live modestly and comfortably. So I don't need my novels to make a lot of money, to pay a mortgage or raise children or anything like that. That One Match Fire exists at all is sufficient. However, I would like it to have a life. It doesn't have to be a bestseller, but it ought to make some sales. It's in several libraries now, things like that. And that's a goal I have. Not fame and fortune so much as something in the way of respect for the fiction, that it's good enough to be out there and on people's shelves. Now, in addition to these three novels, I have two other completed novels that are vastly different. One is something like a horror novel, though there's nothing supernatural in it, and the other is outrageous metafiction where the characters know their characters in the novel and where that leads them. And sure, I'd like to see those published, and I'm doing my best to market those, but not getting any traction yet. But if I could continue to sit at my computer and write for 4 or 5 hours a day, doing what I'm doing, that would meet my goal. That would be sufficient in itself.
Well, let's hope that that continues for you.
I do too.
If people want to learn more about you and your books, what you have going on, new releases, that sort of thing, where can they go to find you?
I have a webpage that my clever daughter and son-in-law made for me. It's paullamwriter.com. That has my bio. It has links to my published stories. It has link to my blog. It lists my media appearances and reviews and so forth. It also has links to my social media sites. I'm on Facebook and Instagram. I think that's it. And that's where they can do it. Now, I had to name it paullambwriter.com because there is a paullamb.com. It's a British blues musician, and he got the URL ahead of me. So I had to distinguish that I'm a writer.
And if people are interested in picking up a copy of One Match Fire, where can they go to buy it?
It's on all the online outlets, Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Bookshop. Any bookstore can order it as well. It's available directly from the publisher, Blue Cedar Press. And actually, I found a number of copies online through the used bookstore ABE Books. So you can get a discounted copy there if you want.
Well, Paul, I want to wish you luck with One Match Fire and the other two books in the trilogy, and also those other books that you have waiting in the wings. I'll keep your fingers crossed that you find a landing place for those. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you very much.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.